Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 5. Upon the resumption of his post in Tanais, the king stayed and conducted all of the business of the kingdom there for many years. This wrought some confusion as to whether Tanais or Coriscos was, at that time, the capital city, furthered by neither appearing to be a city worthy of commanding such vast territories as were being claimed. It seems that Spartacus was willing to consider both realities equally true, which was a fine example to set in a kingdom where differing understandings were being cooked together at once. It was, one imagines, in pursuit of this mixing of worlds that Spartacus released the tyrant Herodotus from prison, where he had fallen to after the Lithosis Manus begrudgingly took his surrender. Likewise, Herodes, the chief captain of the rebels, was not explicitly punished for this role, although he perished from battle wounds quickly, and the gods were presumed to have seen this fit. Since the military and political affairs of the Tanais Anacopeia region are covered in detail in other works, and are not especially remarkable to those familiar with Bosporan records, we shall focus on the furthering of Prince Pairisades' journey, for a new leg to his quest was at last brought on after much waiting. This was after a large measure of work had been applied to Coriscos by all manner of peoples, and it had become something that undoubtedly would be a kingdom's capital were it not so distant and poorly known to the world. The Greeks had surrounded the whole of the old city with walls, and renovated the ancient road system, such that travel inside the town was swift and efficient in most weathers. The Lithoses had established supply posts in the region that brought lumber and animal products in daily batches, and indeed it was, strangely, the forest people whose carts and wagons proved to be the most productive, much to the ire of southern carpenters. With so many of the colonists being former nomads, the quality of the farms around the city was limited. However, this was made up for by the trading of well-reared horses to the Greeks at Olbia, who brought fish and wheat by wagon and riverboat without fail. What they truly wished to trade for was slaves, yet despite overtures of war seeming to abound, the first lands were peaceful at this time. The mere reputation of the city had grown sufficient to shield it, and since nothing of particular note can be said to explain this, we must recourse to say that it was the ongoing fear of the Lithosis among the still outcast tribes of the steppe that kept the peace. Still, military work was a daily feature of city business, as Pairisades was forming an expeditionary army to venture out in search of the lost runestones. This process could not be completed quickly due to the shortage of spare labour, not to mention the fact that this expedition would not be returning for harvests or key festivals, making its recruitment more akin to forming a mercenary band or colonial body. The chosen method to prepare for this was to rely upon the instructions of Lithosis Manos veterans, whose words were, by now, understood to a workable degree by a cadre of interpreters the city council had sponsored. As you might have gathered, the Lithosis were not interested in learning any Greek or Sarmatian for themselves. In this way, thousands received at least some training, and hundreds were chosen for dedicated practice, promised a spot in the purportedly lucrative military business to come. Seasons and years passed before this was completed, and of the intervening time there is one event that stands out as the most important. Here is what happened. First, recall that the Lithoses had been searching the far reaches of the First Lands to reconnect with encampments of their kin scattered here and there, and it so happened that some strains of their people had become so marginal that they had enjoyed little contact with others for quite some time. Notable among such groups was a clan that resided in the distant northeast, where the darkness of the World's Edge forest was more intense, yet did not extend so far south, allowing closer passage to the outer sea, although accessing it was still impossible via this route. Once contact was re-established with these people, a dispute prompted Gwenna to take a large number of her people to treat with them, and she invited Pairisades to attend. After requesting that the city council mandate the journey, he had the Hierophants divine the will of the gods. It is said that no particular portents were found, and some took this to mean that neither good nor evil would come of the meeting. In fact, it was more likely that these events were taking mankind so far outside of the histories that the gods had imagined, that they had simply not yet decided how to indicate their desires on the topic, if those desires had even been formulated. For those who insist the gods never provide omens on events that have not happened before or won't happen again, this story will likely persuade them only further. Travelling quickly and without any wagons or caravans, Pairisades and Gwenna led a few hundred riders to Silis, then to the north and east, at least as far in both directions again as they had come from Kariskos. They created a final encampment overlooking a curled river, from where the World's End forest was visible when the fog and darkness was not too great. They planned to venture into the forest, yet no such thing was required, for 3 riders in white furs approached the camp at first light, which was not brighter than starlight. They were pale, and their skin was decorated with red stripes running from their eyes and mouth to their jaw. The tribe of Gwenna found this humorous, for the pattern was associated with virginal girls in their tradition, and here it was in use on the faces of 3 mounted lancers. Presumably they kept this slight to themselves, for a greater meeting was negotiated in which the grand body of the northerner tribes emerged from the woods. Notably, they had a large unmounted contingent, wore thicker jackets, and on balance appeared less Greek than those seen before. Later it would be said they bore resemblance to mountain folk of far eastern Tarim, a people hardly known to those living comfortably on the inner sea, said to have been known to Alexander and later eastern kingdoms. Having never met such a person, I cannot attest one way or the other. Since they spoke a similar language to Gwenna's tribe, and also called themselves Lithosis Manus, I shall, for the sake of explanation, refer to these new forest folk as Morrow, which is the name the Greeks used for the outpost they would eventually establish, meaning, if one transliterates with enough creativity, people from the sea, or people from the water. This outpost was located beside the young river mentioned prior, which was later found to stretch down into Sarmatian territories located between the Hyrcanian Ocean and the Outer Sea. In those lands the river is called Ra, and it was not known to them where it originated. So claim those familiar with Sarmatian pastoralists, who are the only people willing to live in those desolate lands so far from aid. What the Lithosis of Gwenna and these Morrow shared most strongly in common was their love for Manos, and what was most different about them was their view on whether this god worked alone. To the Morrow, there was no question that the source of Manos's power was not inherent to his being, as the Lithosis had thought, but it was brought about by a heroic offering by another force. There was squabbling here, and it ended in blood. However, before I detail this, allow me to enlighten you as to the true parts of what the Morrow could add to our understanding of the past. Indeed, they had runestones of their own, and they would both answer and pose questions sufficient to invite ravenous hunger in any reader. The crux lies in the beginning of the tale. You may recall that Manos is said to have created the world through the power of sacrifice. The Lithosis claimed it was his own power as a god that was sacrificed to summon the world. But the Morrow had the truth of it. He sacrificed the very existence of another god. This god was called Taurus, god of light, one of many who were like him. His form was that of a golden bull, and he volunteered to be sacrificed when Manos proposed that the powers of flesh be transmuted into powers of material creation. It was from this noble act that the deed of sacrificing Taurus's followers in the world, bulls and cattle, gained a like power, albeit only fractional in strength. Indeed, there are countless peoples across the world who seemed to be aware that bull sacrifice was a source of magic. For example, in Attila, the word Taurus refers to bulls, and the Tauris Peninsula, upon which the Bosporans built cities, could be said in retrospect to have been named this by the local Scythians in half-remembered reference to their bull creator, which was done because the peninsula has a peculiar shape with elongations to the sides, evoking a bull's horns. Now we see that it was the Morrow who remembered the progenitor of this. Even the Lithosis, who had forgotten the name Tauris, were careful to worship cattle wherever they were kept, and used their blood often in their rituals of rejuvenation. Of course, they also had an interest in the use of human blood, and it is not that they were entirely mistaken in that tradition, for while the sacrifice of Tauris was attested to in the runestones of the Morrow, the wording implied that one other was involved in that first act of magic, one who was a human god like Manos. With the stones incomplete and scattered, this left an infuriating void in the most crucial part of the divine revelations, that in time a new and budding alliance of Lithosis, Morrow and Bosporan would pursue with appropriate zeal. First though, allow me to account a remarkable incident from the first meeting with these peoples of the sea. The origin of that name, it is said, is in a quest they had undertaken to reach the outer sea in centuries prior, which is where they were cursed with their pale skin and dull eyes by the lost spirits trapped there. After some days of debate, and the addition of many new Morrow arrivals to the moot camp, Gwenna proposed that a sacrifice be made in order to restore the lost connection between the two tribes. She, it is noted, was already fully convinced that the Morrow had the right of it in the debate, and this is demonstrated by the fact she proposed the sacrifice be of a black bull and a white cow, decorated with blood patterns in a certain style. The stakes were raised when the Morrow instead insisted that it would be their opponents in the matter whose methods should be tested, that is to say, that a human sacrifice should be made. This caused an uproar of sorts, yet it was not disapproving. In fact, several youths came forward and appeared to be clamouring for the honour of losing their life in this way. Most were girls, and Pairisades notes that this was of concern to the Lithosis, who preferred sacrifices to be men, and in particular those whose achievements to life and contributions to the cause were already many. Then there was disagreement on the method, for the Morrow seemed to wish to slit the throat of the offering in a manner similar to the bovine method. However, the Lithosis disapproved of this, and I'm sure you will wonder why, given their interest in scattering the blood of the fallen in battle. In other circumstances, they focused more on the loss of life itself, in particular of the cessation of breath. They would even consider a peaceful death of a sleeping elder to be equal in value to a battlefield bloodletting, although the logic behind this is hard to discern. Therefore, it could be said that loss of life in any circumstance was a worthy sacrifice, which is a pleasant notion for those whose coming to life is the only achievement they have to give show for themselves. In summary, then, the bickering carried on as lives were staked in the name of friendship, and none present seemed to pass any contradiction or irony in the scene, save the perplexed prince. Ultimately, a bull was sacrificed in an ordinary fashion, and a champion from the Morrow was attached to Pairisades' bodyguard after a ritual in which this champion abandoned his prior life, a form of sacrifice promised for a future time, when the power of such an act could be fully utilized. It is not especially hard to imagine that all bodyguards, when properly selfless and dutiful, possess this power. Everyone seemed to be pleased with this outcome, and an embassy of the Morrow was established in Kariskos the next year to further this new connection. The addition of the Morrow to the coalition of peoples in the city only enhanced the need for further discovery of runestones, but through their supplying of warriors, powerful shortbows, and good horses, the time needed to prepare for this expedition was cut. In the spring of the year 190, Pairisades sent a lavishly gifted caravan to Tanais in order to pay tribute to his king, and to deliver a full account of his military plans. Then, long before a reply could be received, he set off to enact these plans in the west. Notably, he did not ask for Spartacus's permission to embark on this grand business, although he had both the blessing of the Kariskos Council and had been drip-feeding Spartacus on his ambitions to seek more godwords without any explicit injunction against it being given. I think it is fair to say it was about as proper as adherence to authority can be between two ambitious royal brothers. Additionally, Spartacus was generally kept informed of the prince's business via the same spy that Hienon had relied upon, Diotrephes. Now garrison commander of Kariskos, This stalwart had been absent from the prince's recent ventures, and it is surprising that when the army was forming to ride west in 190, he was not brought with it. He expressed his own displeasure at this in his letters, hoping perhaps that the king might use royal decree to effectively banish him from his lavish post so that he might take up the more exciting one at the side of his old friend. Had Pairisades forgotten said friendship? We have little to go on, although the course of events to come suggests that he had at least some need for his reliable companion yet, and that the trust placed in him as garrison commander of a de facto capital city was not to be dismissed as ungratefully as Diotrephes did. The army formed for the pursuit of runestones and blood was, naturally, mostly a body of Lithosis Manus riders. They numbered at least 2,000. They were attached to a slow-moving caravan of civilians to conduct engineering works and provide the labour for upkeeping the expedition over its undefined duration. There were also a number of auxiliaries from the allied tribes, the Scythians, Sarmatians, Cimmerians, Roxolani and Iazyges from the east, and the Tauri, Carpiani and Bastani from the west. It is said that of the Moromar, only a single warrior was present in this group, that being the aforementioned champion, whose forfeited life was now in the hands of the gods. Their first destination was known to them already through the work of Gwena Greekspeaker, who had determined that there was a place to the northwest of Chariskos, where a city on the fringes of the World's End forest still existed. The people there had previously made themselves known to Chariskos, and were called the Helisi. They claimed that Chariskos could not exist, for the land it rested on was sacrosanct. The Lithosis Manus agreed, only for them that was the reason why the city must exist. Inevitably, the Helisi were members of the so-called anti-Golden Age coalition, referred to at the time by the term half-men, which the Bosporans had adopted from the Lithosis, perhaps not entirely appreciating that this term was meant to denigrate Bosporans and other civilized peoples in particular. Such is the way the meaning of words twist at the borders of cultures, and those changes can go on to make significant impacts, as you must be aware. At the cusp of autumn, early in the year as it was, recall, the Chariskosi caravan approached this ancient city. It was called Palteskia, a word from the west, for the people here, while ostensibly descendants of full men, as the Lithosis claimed to be, had been conquered many times by the innumerable wandering folk of the Black Forest realm that constitutes the frontier of Europe with the Outer Sea. This is where many people who have caused enormous consternation in the world, such as the Cimbri and Scodissi, are said to have been born. These Helisi, then, were enemies to both those forest people and the forest people from the world's edge, leaving them at quite the impasse. Surely they believed their own valour would see such concerns dashed away, for their reaction to the coming of Pairisades and company was to deploy a large and fearsome army. They camped at strategic points along a river, named Hippanis by the Greeks later on, such that Pairisades would have to challenge them in order to cross. They outnumbered the Bosporans by at least double, and the viable channels to ford the river were narrow and few. There were no bridges even this close to a large city, indicating the unsophisticated turn this city had taken since the Golden Age. After Gwena's scouts located the best of the fords, for its quality in crossing and slightness of deviation from a straight route to the city, Pairisades brought everyone there into a single camp. The Helisi did the same, and it seemed that a battle would be fought at once. 2 days passed without action though, and it was obvious that neither side saw any advantage to crossing. Gwena Greekspeaker proposed a strategy whereby the river should be blocked upstream with earthworks and wooden gates. This was the sort of proposal an industrious people unfamiliar with the grand scale of warfare in the modern age would make, hoping to rely on their hands and crafts to achieve what a skilled command of soldiers can do more simply. Pairisades provides us with clear demonstration of this in the events that follow. When the Helisi sent envoys forwards, bearing news from their king, who was named Atticus, their speech was surprisingly pleasing. Not only did they have some knowledge of Greek to employ, but they presented lavish gifts. These were, it was understood, a payment offered in exchange for the expedition going to instead trouble their rivals to the south, the Tauri. Not only had such rivals already pledged to the prince's cause, but there was no sum of money that could equal a runestone's words, so this surprisingly cowardly offer was turned away. Pairisades was willing to let slip that it was stones he was after, wishing to see what reply he would get. Soon he received another envoy expressing incredulity on the matter, with further recommendation that the expedition go elsewhere. This was precisely the manner of reply the prince had hoped for. That same night, he removed his camp and pulled the expedition back beyond the Halise's site. The Halisi sent out their scouts and found that Pairisades had not encamped again, but appeared to be travelling away. At this, they became convinced that their scheme had succeeded in one way or another and did not pursue. Furthermore, their force at the riverside began to withdraw in various directions, returning to the domains of lesser chiefs. This delighted Pairisades, who proclaimed that not only was victory nigh, but that he was certain the city ahead really did have runestones, and further, they understood their meaning. Ultimately, the important result was that he turned the expedition back around and returned to the river quickly. By leaving the slower elements behind, he was able to cross suddenly with 2,000 riders before the Halisi warbands could be recalled. However, this was not so much of a boon, due to the fact that he needed to secure the crossing to bring his camp with him, so he had to stay close by and battle with whoever came to challenge him. To begin with, only a small number of warriors on foot were nearby, and the prince had no trouble leading his horses in and out of battle to harry his foes with arrows and lances. The main body of Articus's army was rallying close by, inspiring those already at the riverbank to try and hold out. Indeed, the river and its swampy surrounds allowed them to find good footing against the horsemen, and the skirmish carried on for most of the day. Pairisades was not especially worried by this, for he knew that the Halisi fought on foot, and thus would not arrive to the battle soon or strong. But the tribe was able to wield a weapon that the prince had not anticipated. A band of several hundred tattooed riders who came down the river with lance and bow, and first appeared to be his own troops. No preparations were made to resist their coming. That they were actually in his enemy's employ was discovered too late, when he had already begun to approach them to receive reports. With a cry, the newcomers charged into the prince's entourage with lances levelled. With his cloak and helmet marking him out, Pairisades made for an easy target. Yet now the Morrow vow was fulfilled in full, in sight of all, when their champion leapt from his horse and dashed the foremost attacker with his own body, sparing Pairisades and perhaps others through the disruption he caused. Seeing the oath kept filled the other Lithosis riders with the light of Tauris, and they cut forwards into the crowd of enemies as if they were harvesting cereals. The enemy were fierce, but unused to seeing any of their own prowess reflected in their opponents, and now this was more than this. They were outmatched, and those who lived withdrew, their plot to end the prince's crusade duly foiled by agreed-upon price with the gods. Some riders pursued for a time, however the main body of the Halisi force was approaching. This force would have to be dispersed to advance further, and moreover, it was better to face them in the open than at the city itself. So while the chance to withdraw entirely was had, Pairisades composed his troops and prepared to make a stand with his back to the river. The battle that came next is an example of why many of the more established tribes on the rim of the steppe retained a fear of the nomads that doubtless stretched back to the violent times at the end of the Golden Age. The rhythm of the fighting was like this. The Lithosis and Bosporans rode about the riverbank, divided into some 10 or 20 companies, and let themselves come away from the river so that the Halisi might seek its protection themselves. Pairisades could not be said to be controlling this situation, and it was as if there was no general at all, and yet by simply keeping their distance from the slower infantry, there was no threat posed by even a well-coordinated push against any of the small detachments. After some hours, this unusual dance left the Halisi cautiously guarding the river ford, while the prince and his warriors surrounded the position on both sides of the river. Since there had been countless arrows let fly during the maneuvering, the river banks were littered with blood in both directions, and the white-blue water darkened and began to smell under the gentle, distant sun of evening. However, with the Helici being strongly equipped with shields and mail, the damage had been less than the Lithosis wanted. Moreover, their supply of arrows was depleted, and returning to the caravan now to restore the stock in sufficient number could have allowed their cornered, bloodied foe to come to their senses and flee to their prepared defences in the city. While Pairisades again put forward Greek strategy to carry on from this juncture, it was steppe trickery that came to the fore, quite outside of the prince's control, he later complained. Complain he might, but the effectiveness of the ploy the Lithosis instinctively commenced was undeniable. They made no secret of their lack of arrows, throwing their bows over their shoulders, or even removing the strings so that the shaft straightened and the bone-capped ends might be used like a pick. This weapon was not effective, but seeing it emboldened the Helici. The Lithosis began to ride towards and away from the mass of enemies, giving the impression that they were too afeared to commit to a fight. This emboldened their foe further. Eventually, small groups of eager warriors came out to challenge for open combat, and when the Lithosis turned away, the footmen began to give chase as if they had snatched up a victory from their dire arrangement. This was a common trick that infects the minds of those desperate to see a military reverse without understanding the flow of strategy. Once they were somewhat clear of the close aid their comrades might provide them, the Helici found that the Lithosis actually had axes, knives, swords, and wide shields among their inventories. The horses turned, and what had looked like a cowardly scampering became a brutal charge. Once the leading Helici were caught and scattered by these attacks, the unravelling of the rest of the army came quickly, like the pulling of a single thread undoing a garment. It is said that those yet to engage would come out of the formation to rescue those already in peril, and in so doing create the opportunity for they themselves to be imperiled. King Artachis had no ability to control the basic instinct of his fighters, even as it led them to their doom time and again. Thus the great army of the Helici was broken apart and slaughtered. It is said that the number of casualties for Pairisades was 600, although this seems too high, and for Artachis it was no fewer than 6,000. More were taken prisoner on the days to come, and while they rightly might have been made slaves, the Lithosis had their own uses for vanquished peoples, and therefore purchased from Pairisades the right to command the survivors, paying the prince in lands and wealth, which he gladly accepted, seeing as he had no easy way to sell slaves besides, with there being no intention to return to friendly markets at that time. Paltescia was surrendered, and a new king, named Wulfia, was appointed to serve as satrap to Spartacus in the region. The city was not sacked because of the humility shown by Wulfia and its inhabitants, who found accepting defeat and bowing their heads to be easy. Since this was not the only city that the Helici controlled, there was the risk that the affair would continue. However, Wulfia negotiated peace on behalf of his people, whose lands were discovered to extend far into the interior of the uncharted European forests. The price for this was exactly what the expedition had come for, the city's relics. Among them was indeed a runestone trove of ancient origin, some of which were copies of ones already seen, and others were new. While there is more to say on what was learned, I will first mention a remarkable thing that Pairisades did in the city which surprised everyone. He sent quick riders to follow the trail the expedition had left and establish contact with Coriscos. The distance took almost a week to travel even by this quick method, demonstrating just how vast the old lands of the world are. Once the prince was sure that the journey could be made in good time, he went to Coriscos with 100 riders. They did not dismount when they arrived, and rode straight to the council chamber, in such a way that some felt that the city was under attack, and a panic commenced. Diotrephes came from the nascent citadel close by with 500 men, and more began to gather here and there around the city. Once Diotrephes realized that it was the prince who had occupied the council chamber, he went personally to intervene. There, the prince had seated his companions around the chamber and stood at the rostra like a magistrate awaiting a defendant. Diotrephes came in and unwittingly played his part in the scene. First, Pairisades announced that Diotrephes was no longer fit for office as garrison commander, to the shock of the latter. Then the prince produced formal documents that indicated his intention to adopt Diotrephes into the royal house, making the pair father and son, although Diotrephes was the elder. Diotrephes was speechless at this sudden proposal, being that not only had it been delivered on the back of what seemed to be a reprimanding and confiscation of power, but that his old friend had not offered the slightest pleasantry or greeting to soften this daunting audience. When the 100 gathered companions on the benches began to bay for Diotrephes to accept, he took the papers and their blessing as if it was his duty, and from here it was only a matter of formality that delayed the adoption for 3 days, due to difficulties in acquiring the correct auspices. Diotrephes, in his writing, offers no explanation for this sudden affair. Pairisades wrote of it, "I find that adventuring is a tiring thing, ever more so, and yet I cannot feel a drop of blood in my body that would go without it, and therefore I must recruit what aid is necessary to bend to my destiny." I shall cease quoting him here, for in truth, his comment on the decision was lengthy and without much meaning. I believe that he had come to regret his time without his bodyguard, especially after seeing the Morrow champion slain so close by. It could also be said that Diotrephes was a part of life that, like adventuring, the prince felt a fear of estrangement from. Since the adoption caused Diotrephes to be of a rank too high to hold the post of garrison commander, he was then free to seek office as he wished, and when the prince offered that he would be a strategos of the western expedition, he agreed heartily. As for his replacement, it was a Greek of little note, who was left those 100 riders as an additional force. A nobleman is said to have pronounced, 100 men is no replacement for one Diotrephes, and there is plenty of evidence in support of his sentiment. In conclusion, Diotrephes and Pairisades took a herd of horses and departed with only their personal attendants, and no doubt Diotrephes was awed by the tales of battle the prince could offer. And furthermore, the very field itself was still red, bloody, and marked with the circular patterns of the dead which the Lithosis liked to leave. It is said that the battlefield was left in this state for a long time, and the land came to be known as the Marsh of Yimo. This name stems from important details of the freshly translated Golden Age stones, and I shall commence the following chapter with the relevant and true portions of this story for your reference. While it might have been a shock to King Spartacus to learn later that he had been given a nephew, he would have been happy with this arrangement, for his chances of learning what else his brother was doing with the family name were risen. There is also much that must be said of what Spartacus was doing during the events relayed above, for the king was an active and ambitious ruler, and being in possession of a brother with similar qualities, they were like two burning trees whose fires forever primed the others and brought about unusual brightness. The king planned to seize upon the expansion of Greek maps and facilitate the bringing of his kingdom to forgotten lands, so that they might be remembered again for the first time in the current age as being possessions of the Spartakids, a notion that would invite the suggestion that this was a natural thing for them to be. Alas, his intentions were not in harmony with all those who lived in the first lands, and the king would come to see war coursed through the very earth of the steppe, and all who walked above were the playthings of Ares and Dyaeus alike.